Well, hello, friends and fellow pioneers. This is a very personal broadcast where I'm going to be sharing with you something about myself and my own journey of being an immigrant. 30 years ago this week, I left Venezuela with my family to move to the United States. And for the last 30 years, I have either lived in the southern part of the United States or in Mexico. And I wanted to take this time to share the top 10 things that I've learned these last 3 decades. I can't believe that it's been so long, so fast. So I was 12 years old. I had just turned 12 and we came to the United States, and I just celebrated my 42nd birthday. Okay, so I wrote it down, and I'm going to be referencing that to stay on track. And it's just going to be very personal. I'm sharing with you what it's just what I've observed, what I've watched, and I only narrowed it down to 10 things. So obviously, I'm not sharing everything I've learned the last 30 years, but I hope that this will inspire you. Either you relate to being an immigrant, or you're married to an immigrant, or you're the child of an immigrant, um, or an immigrant, and you can maybe see things from their perspective. Obviously, not all immigrants are the same, but from the perspective of, producers, of investors, and, I do believe that people that are immigrants who are not consumer minded, but more producer minded, they actually have an advantage. And so I'm going to share with you the top 10 things that I learned. I hope that you will share with me, you'll comment below and share with me, what's your personal story, with immigrants? And did you have any experience growing up? Were there many in your town? Are you from a family of immigrants? Did you have direct contact? So, number one thing that I learned from being away from my homeland these last 30 years is there's a benefit. Like I was talking about the advantage, the number one thing that I value most is, and it's actually the most painful thing, but being displaced, the displacement, the actual physical, emotional, and spiritual disadvantage at the beginning that you have from being removed from where you are, the place of comfort, to a place of complete discomfort. That's actually that temporary isolation that you feel in that transition time. It kind of reminds me of naturally in our bodies. I've been learning a lot about natural health, more so in the last year and a half. And I was studying about the mitochondria, and there's something called hormesis. Look it up. Ari Whitten is my favorite uh, person or teacher that talks about this. But hormesis is something that we need. We need, I don't know if you've noticed in the day, in a natural day, if you're not inside in a climate control environment, have you noticed how it's cooler in the morning and then it heats up and then it gets warmer? Really, generally, no matter what the season is, there is some kind of fluctuation. So it's cooler in the morning, then it gets hotter during the day, and then it gets cooler again in the evening. So our body needs, like our being needs these type of changes, in these type of stressors. When you work out, when you are in the gym, or you're doing whatever physical activity to strengthen your muscles, you want to have that resistance so that you can grow, so that your muscles grow. So that's number one, most important thing, and that I valued the most. And I actually did not appreciate it so much as to when, I guess it was 12 years ago, around 12 years ago, in 2008, we prepared to go to Mexico. We actually didn't leave until the early months in 2009. And being expats, like after having settled in the United States and then being expats in Mexico, that right there, after I came back, after this last decade, after being back, I look back, and that opportunity to kind of cut the umbilical cord with being in the rat race of the society and the systems that we were in, and being isolated, displaced, temporarily, that was a wonderful thing. It was hard to be isolated. It was hard to be displaced, but it was wonderful. It it was it was like a challenge that we needed to expand and to grow into new things. So, being that this is my really the biggest value, spent the most time in that. The second thing is language. My parents had invested in me having private tutors for English. I went to a school where I was taught English. Um, Whatever private education that I had that they invested in for me to learn English really did not help me. Why? Because I wasn't surrounded by English speakers. So I learned that really the best thing you can do is to immerse yourself. Kind of like, let's say you're going to buy a motorcycle, you're going to buy a bicycle, let's say, and you've never ridden one, or you are trying to learn things. You can only go so far, and actually very far, reading about how to ride a bike. I mean, you can learn some tips, but really you have to get on there. You can't be afraid to fall because it's inevitable. Something will happen and you'll mess up, and that's just part of the learning. And how you really truly learn is that survival, that that challenge, right? So that brings me to number 3. So number 1 was displacement, the value of displacement. Number 2 was language. And I will go back to language and say that I actually created a curriculum for learning languages, specifically Hebrew. But the thing is that learning language naturally is the biggest value. So if you're taking on something new, learn it in a way that naturally you would learn as a child. And that takes me to 3. Identity, right? Where we were born and where we live, or where we grow up, it's not our identity. However, it's hard to go into a new place and being displaced, to not kind of, I'm going to call it, some of you may or may not understand what I'm saying, but it's kind of becomes like an idol, what other people think, what the new people think of you and where you came from and how you sound and all of that. So there's some permanent, I could call it, damage from number 3. I am sure that you notice some accent in the way that I speak. A lot of people have a really hard time, and I'm like such an enigma to them because they can't figure out, like, some words I have no accent and some I do, and what's going on? Like, where am I from? Well, the reason for that, it kind of was strategic on my part. When I was 12, I was in 7th grade, and if you're familiar with how the grades are in the American system, so 7th grade is like it's the first year after elementary school. It's a very hard year to be different and to be learning a new language and to be either the outcast or the person that sticks out. So that was me, okay? That was me being Latin immigrant in the South, where I grew up, there weren't a lot of immigrants. There were some because it was a college town, but we weren't a majority, or a majority in minorities. So very few of us were there at that time. And so it just really bothered me that I was singled out by having an accent and being different. And I mean, if you can't communicate, that's really frustrating as a child, right? So I was terrified of messing up. I carried around a little pocket dictionary and a little notepad and a pen, and I would form sentences. I write down, like, I to forget. I mean, and then people would be like, oh, you forgot something. And thankfully there were generous people around me that would try to decipher what I was trying to say. So there's really 2 things that I learned for number 3. To just be able, especially as an adult, child may not be able to grasp this, but to be able to just not have the crisis of identity. I did not want to have an accent, so I worked really hard. And to this day, right now I'm speaking to you, I go through a filter. It's kind of slow, and I'm trying to sound a certain way. And I wish I had an accent because that is really part of my history. But I worked so hard to have my identity blend with my environment and be a chameleon that I lost that seasoning in the way that I speak. Now, when I'm really tired or when I'm around people that are actually, if I'm around any other people that speak other languages, I will start picking up their accent. But naturally, this is just how I speak now, and it's permanent. So that is a disadvantage of not having of not understanding that your identity is not based on, it doesn't have to go in crisis because of how you think. And to add to number 2 about languages, don't be terrified of learning new languages no matter how old you are. My parents were in their 40s and they had to learn English to study their masters and their doctorate, their PhDs in a new language that they didn't speak before. So you can do anything. You really can do anything. You just really need to be strategic about finding what's going to work for you and what's more natural. So to add to number 3, the identity is okay to be human and it's okay to be different. And it's a really hard thing for an immigrant at the beginning. You're just inevitably different being away from home. Number 4 is just appreciating that being an immigrant, no matter how easy it may be waiting for you on the other side, you experience survival, psychological, emotional, spiritual. You experience having to survive that transition, that shift, that change. And, having to go through that experience brings resilience. Like you become more resilient in the process. So, again, things that I've observed. Number 5 thing that I experienced as an immigrant and looking back, it's that it's okay to kind of cut the umbilical cord of where you came from. And some of you may be considering becoming an immigrant, leaving the country that you're in and for such a time as this and being a better position that you feel your family can withstand this pandemic and the events. But it's okay to not go and find people that are from your same nest. You're in a new place. You probably there's so much wisdom in trying to forge new relationships with people that are of the new place or that have learned how to do things in the new place that you're in. You don't have to just always go back to the comfortable in the new place. It's okay to fly a new route, and it's okay to cut the umbilical cord. And that leads me to the next thing, I'm trying to do it for the screen. So number 6 is understanding it's not like you can become just totally independent, and being independent or independent is 2 ditches. Okay, it's 2 extremes. But understanding that there's so much value in becoming interdependent, and interdependent in relationships and systems that work for you and your family, that are going to serve you well. So number 7 is I just really appreciate how people did embrace us and try to learn about us, and learned. I was trying to kind of put words to it, but to be embraced and to learn from us and to get to know us for who we were, at that time as immigrants, and for the seasons that we're going to. Some of my, best friends from that time, there's really nothing I had to offer. I was the, most different, and in my opinion, it's not like I was offering them a whole lot. They were extending grace. They were being generous. And that leads me to number 8. Number 8 is that kindness knows no limits. When we arrived, there was a congregation, a church that had been contacted by a friend and made arrangements for them to help us. We kind of had some people in common, and this congregation took us in, and this church found an apartment. Like, we didn't know the language. So they found an apartment. The pastor drove like, I don't know, 3.5 hours to come pick us up at the international airport. Then they had already gotten the apartment, had taken in donations of furniture, kitchen, goods, supplies like school supplies and those types of things. So for the first few weeks, and lots of food also. So we got there, we didn't really have to figure out how to do everything from the start. They had made a provision for us to have the basic things that we would need, even school supplies. And they had talked to a local private school that was willing to let me come and sit in at no cost to just kind of learn the language and get acclimated. I mean, that was just amazing. And so I'm so, so grateful that these people went out of their way to help us and to make that transition that was already very hard a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more bearable, because we had never lived in this country before. I will add that pastor let us borrow his personal vehicle for, I believe it was like a month, while we found one for us and all of the things that that we needed to do, the errands we needed to run, something like that. So imagine just being generous and enduring a little bit of discomfort to allow other people who have a lot of discomfort to get settled in. So I will never forget. These are things that an immigrant never forgets, because it's like your foundation, how you get established. So that little bit of inconvenience marked me and my family for life and gave us a pattern for how to pay it forward, because it's not that we wouldn't be generous, but we wouldn't have known exactly all the things they came up with. We're just incredibly generous and so kind. And so that leads me to the number 9 thing that I wanted to share, is that I think that the reason that they were able to do so much for us is that they were in community. They had an organized group. This happened to be a church, but whatever community, whatever group allows people to support other people more quickly. It's like a turnkey way to disseminate the vision and to get things done and to help people in need. And you see that when there's a fire, when there are other disasters or crises. But when a family is being displaced for other reasons other than natural disaster, that's a benefit too. So there's so much more to community and the benefits of community that I experienced based on all the things we were able to be blessed by in our journey. And number 10 is very personal, I guess, just to talk about this. But number 10 is that love knows no nationality or color. And I have observed so much polarization in the last, especially the last few years. First in Venezuela with some political things that happened, but in the last year in the United States. And I'm not out to get myself banned here, so I'm not going to go into details. But the weapon that I see is, it's almost like, it's just like the elephant in the room. Like, it's just there and it's everywhere, and it's just few people are talking about the actual strategy and weapon is polarization. And so, like I said, I saw it happen in Venezuela with certain, well, I'll just go ahead and say it, with Chavez, how that divided families, just, and the country was so divided, and there was this idea of pro and con and the opposition, which I personally do not believe in sides. I do not believe in that, but that's a story for another time, a topic for another time. So, but the idea of there being these two sides, or however many sides, and polarization. The reason it's personal to me, or maybe it's personal and to me, some people may, I don't know, find it controversial or whatever. This is just my own experience. But, children are a mirror of their environment. And I've heard it say, like children are colorblind. Well, that was my personal experience. Okay. I grew up watching certain shows that were American shows, and they were either dubbed. They generally, yeah, they were dubbed. It was like a voiceover. It's in Spanish. And I remember watching the Cosby Show many years. I was 12 by the time that we arrived. And I did not know, I really did not know that in other countries there were these such things called racists. My parents, we didn't live like that. In my country, there were people of different shades of color. I was considered dark in my family, and I had a term of endearment for that. That would be considered extremely politically incorrect, but that's just how we grew up. If you were darker skinned, you were called that color, and it was a term of endearment. Like, we see you, and that's just how we know you, right? Like, I don't know, maybe people would be called like shorty or something. I don't know. It's not necessarily the most polite, but what I'm saying is I just grew up with physical features just being something that you just openly talk about, and I didn't know that other places were so much more divided about that. And so when I moved to the southern US, wow, that was kind of a shock for me to see the polarization, racial polarization. I grew up with socioeconomic polarization, but I did not grow up with racial polarization. All countries have polarization that divides them. But anyway, I just want you, to know in my personal story that I did not know that about the United States. And so as a 7th grader, 12-year-old, I started learning and observing that there were all these things that I just did not experience growing up, and that my parents didn't teach me to discriminate against. And so, if you have children in your life, just know that whatever you discriminate against, whatever things you see, they're going to see. And if you don't teach them to see that in that way, just because everybody else sees it that way, they don't have to. They really don't have to be corrupted early, like, life will come and life will, they will see that other people act like that. But that just wasn't my experience. And so if you are in a situation where you have immigrants in your life, maybe this will help you to see things in their perspective a little bit more. I don't know really all the different ways that this can benefit the people that are watching, but I just felt inspired to share my personal experience of being an immigrant for the last 30 years. And there's so much more, and feel free to ask questions in the comments. I'd be happy to share, within reason, what my experiences have been of living in Venezuela, living in the United States, living in Mexico, travel abroad, but we didn't really live other places permanently. And the last thing I want to share is that if you are an immigrant, I would love to hear. I'm curious what your experience has been being an immigrant, being married to an immigrant, or being the child of an immigrant. First generation or second generation. What's life been like just being connected to that transition? Because there's so much that comes with that. And that's all I wanted to share. I really was thinking that I wanted to mark this week. 30 years is a big chunk of my life. And I just didn't want to let this time pass and not just share my personal experience and the richness of it. And it gives me a completely different perspective on the world than other people that may not have had my experience of living abroad and or completely transplanting. And so there's value, I believe, in going through the experience and in sharing the wisdom with others. So if you have any questions, please comment below. Let me know how this video inspired you to either share your story or to ask questions or to reach out and be kind to someone that is coming into your country, maybe leaving. We were not leaving, escaping, or anything like that. It was just a requirement for my parents to further their education, and we had every intention to go back. And the last year of as my parents were wrapping up their dissertation, I met Jason, and he said, "You're not going back?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And then he said, "We'll see about that." And so I did go back. So we both were right. I did go back, but he came to get me. So I've only been away from the US for a few months here and there, like either a summer or something like that. So that was like a semester, chunk of a semester. But primarily for the last 30 years, I have been residing here. So if you have any questions about our story, all of our stories are wild. When we meet with friends, it's very hard for me to keep my story short because they're very, very unique and flavorful and rich of all the things that we've done and how we met and how we got married and everything since has been quite a wild ride. Again, I would really like to hear about your immigrant story. So may the Lord bless you and keep you, shine his face towards you, be gracious unto you, turn his countenance toward you, and give you shalom peace. And you know what? Since we're talking about being immigrants, and I shared about learning Hebrew, that was part of a different goal in life, I'll go ahead and do the blessing in Hebrew as well. Yevarechecha Yehovah v'yishmerecha. Ya'er Yehovah panav elecha v'chuneka. Yisa Yehovah panav elecha v'yasem